Good afternoon, Howard University community. We are grateful for those of you who have joined us today for our Campus Security Authorities training seminar. We promise this will be informative and brief as possible, as not to interrupt your day, but to enrich your day with valuable information about the methodology and the culture and the strategy behind being Campus Security Authority. So again, we appreciate you on behalf of our administration, in particular, our Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer, Dr. Tashnee Ann DeBroy. Thank you so much. We will begin. My name is Jared Carter. I serve as the Director of Operations, Strategy, and Communications for the university in the Office of Operations. And I am greatly privileged to begin our training today with a message from our Executive Director of Safety and Chief of Police, Marcus Lyles, who couldn't join us today, but wanted to be sure that he effectively communicated a preamble for today's event. So, and again, this is our message from Chief of Police Marcus Lyles. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this training session on the importance of campus security authorities. As you all know, campus safety and security is one of the utmost importance to educational institutions, and CSAs play a critical role in ensuring the safety and well-being of students, faculty, and staff. CSAs are individuals who have been designated by their institution to receive and report information about criminal offenses on or near the campus. They serve as a vital link between the campus community and law enforcement, and their role in preventing and responding to crime cannot be overstated. Through this training, we will explore the various responsibilities and duties of CSAs, as well as their legal obligations and the impact they will have on campus safety. We will also discuss best practices for reporting and responding to incidents, as well as strategies for fostering a culture of safety and security on campus. And I hope that by the end of this session, you will have a better understanding of the important role that CSAs play in creating a safe and secure campus environment, and that you will feel equipped with the knowledge and skills necessary to fulfill your responsibilities as a CSA. Thank you for your participation and commitment to campus safety. So, that is from our esteemed Chief of Police, Marcus Lyles. And we now move to the introduction of our keynotes for this afternoon. And we're sure that you guys are going to get a great amount of opportunity for questions. And we want to invite those. Please log those in the Q&A section. I'll be able to facilitate those at various points during the conversation. But we also want to make sure that you have a complete understanding of exactly what it is that we're trying to run here. So we begin with Frank Spano, who serves as Allied Universal's Director of Education Security Services. In this capacity, Frank guides the efforts of the world's largest education security services provider to ensure regulatory compliance and adherence to best practices and contemporary standards in the higher education and K-12 environments. Over the last 21 years, Frank has held positions of increasing responsibility in federal law enforcement, intelligence, counterterrorism, continuity of operations, enterprise risk management, and academia as a college professor, associate dean, and chief academic officer. He's a graduate of the FEMA National Emergency Management Executive Academy, the ICLEA Executive Development Institute, Valley Forge Military College, Wayland Baptist University, Harvard University, and Western Michigan University School of Law, where he served as co-founder and editor-in-chief of the nation's first Homeland and National Security Law Review. We continue with James Moore, who is the Senior Advisor of the Clery Act Compliance and Campus Safety Operations at the United States Department of Education. He serves as the federal government's leading expert on the Clery Act, Drug-Free Schools and Community Act, and other campus safety and crime prevention initiatives. Mr. Moore has led numerous high-profile investigations, including the department's examinations of the Jerry Sandusky and Larry Nassar scandals at Penn State and Michigan State, respectively. He has worked with institutions to design and implement sexual assault prevention programs focused on primary prevention, bystander intervention, and risk reduction, and has served as a subject matter expert for the Federal Bureau of Investigation on a variety of public safety topics. Jim also leads the department's Clery Act training, technical assistance, and outreach initiatives. He's a frequent speaker and trainer on campus safety issues, including sexual assault prevention and response, threat assessment, and substance abuse prevention. He's a member of the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, and from 2014 through 17, he served on the White House Task Force to protect students from sexual assault and was named to the Education Department, Department of Justice, and Health and Homeland Security Task on Sexual Violence in Education in 2022. So we begin. You are now very familiar with our guests for the afternoon. And we will begin with our presentation from Mr. Spano. Mr. Spano, please, with your introduction.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Jarrett. And thank you to each and every one of you for being on the call today. One of the themes that you're going to hear quite a lot about as we continue through today's conversation is the idea of community. I've had the opportunity to work with the Howard University community, to spend time on your campus, and I love it. I love the opportunity to be there. I love the opportunity to see the things that you do as a community, to really be a champion, a landmark institution, and certainly our nation's, I would say, preeminent historically Black college and university. At Allied Universal, as Jarrett mentioned, we're the largest security company in the world. We have over 800,000 security professionals worldwide and are honored to be the largest provider of education security services to not only K-12 and higher ed, but also to HBCUs. We're very honored to be part of the Howard University team. And you've likely seen our Allied Universal professionals, our security professionals on campus, working hand in hand with campus police and public safety. I'd like to take this moment to really thank Akila Adams and Ariel Triplett and Jarrett Carter and the team from Marcus Lyles, Chief Lyles, and the team at Howard University that have made this a priority. I'd like also to thank Jim Moore, my friend, for joining us today. This is a great opportunity, and I think you have a wonderful opportunity to hear it from the horse's mouth, right from the Department of Education, from the leading expert in the nation as it relates to our responsibilities as campus security authorities. As Jarrett mentioned, one of the things that we'd like to talk about today is the idea of this framework of safety and security, the framework of campus community engagement. And so this morning, we're going to lay out some of the model for preparedness. We'll talk about some areas of concern for institutions. Then we'll talk about the action plan. I would take this opportunity to just provide a brief warning. Anything related to campus security or emergency management can at times be traumatic, or it can revive memories of previous traumas in either ourselves or in others. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind everyone on this call and everyone that will see this video that none of us are alone, right? There are resources available, and please do take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Right? This is a difficult topic, but it's something that is a reality on our campuses. It's a reality in our communities, and it's something that we can work together to work through and make a positive difference. And so with that, I'd like to move into our first slide on creating a cycle of preparedness. When we look at campus public safety, it's a continuum, right? I think when we look at this, it really breaks down to what I consider 5 major steps, right? The first one, recognition. The recognized step is critical. Unfortunately, it's all too evident today in today's environment that threats to campuses and threats to public safety are on the rise, right? And those threats aren't always physical. Those threats are at times challenges to our abilities to really be part of a campus community, right? To have that sense of belonging and to really get the most out of that educational experience and our experience alongside our fellow classmates, staff members, faculty, and even guests and visitors on campus. I think that recognition step has become ever more prevalent, right? We see it every day. It seems like every other day, there's another incident on a campus. Each of us, many of us, know individuals who have been impacted. Perhaps we ourselves have been impacted by acts of violence or issues related to mental health or campus belonging. And that makes it evident to us that something must be done. And when we look at phase 2, when we look at step 2, decide, right? We have to decide that enough is enough. We have to decide that now is the time to act. We have to decide not only as an institution, which you certainly have, and we'll talk more about Dr. Frederick and the leadership at Howard University and the steps that he and Chief Lyles and the cabinet and every member of the campus community are taking in order to make the campus a safer place. Deciding to act in our heart, in our mind, knowing that we have the capacity to make a difference, right? It requires us to take action. And that first action step is learn. We have to understand the threats that face our campuses. We have to understand the threats that face our communities, right? Not just in campus life, but around our entire sphere of existence, right? So learning as much as we can, doing things like we're doing right now and continuing, never stop learning. continuing to better understand the threats, the challenges, and the areas of concern, as well as the steps that can be taken, the resources that can be leveraged, and the steps that each of us can play, whether as campus security authorities or as members of our campus community, to make a positive difference. And that leads us to step 4. Step 4 is we have to make it matter, right? If this is just something that we do once a year and we think about our time as a CSA, or we brush it under the rug, or we think that, oh, this couldn't happen to us, right? This couldn't happen here. Unfortunately, there are far too many examples of this couldn't happen to us, or this couldn't happen here, where it did happen to us, and it did happen here, right? I think when we look at, particularly when we look at institutions, HBCUs, that are often an ideological target, and we'll speak more about that as we move forward, for those who would levy hate as a weapon against institutions and individual communities. Making it matter starts at the top. And as I mentioned, Dr. Frederick, Chief Lyles, and the senior leadership at Howard have made it matter. It's on us to continue that. It's on us to continue that movement toward making it matter, not only to ourselves, but to our classmates, to our fellow faculty members, to other members of staff and administration. And finally, making a difference. I think step 5 is probably the hardest, right? Because we can recognize the threat exists. We can make that decision that we're going to act. We can learn as much as we can about it. We can go out and kind of wave the flag and say, this has to be important. This has to be a priority. But taking the affirmative step to make a difference is often the most difficult, because often it requires us to do things that, whether obligated by law, as you will see under the Clery Act and our responsibilities as campus security authority, or obligated by our sense of duty and responsibility to the campus community, we have to take the affirmative step to do the right thing, to make a positive difference in our campus community. And sometimes that requires reporting. Sometimes that requires having a difficult conversation, right? Sometimes that involves being involved in difficult or otherwise traumatic experiences, right? Walking along the road alongside our campus community, right? Hand in hand toward a goal of a safer and more effectively protected community. So we'll look at some areas of concern as we look at our next slide, some areas of concern for campus communities. None of this should likely be a surprise to you, right? I would point you to, in your role as as a campus security authority, and Jim will likely speak about this as well during his section, I would point you to the annual security report. Not only the annual security report at Howard University, but you're in school or you're involved in campus safety and campus security, look up those annual security reports for other colleges and universities, for your family and your friends or others who may ask you about, hey, is this campus safe? What's going on that campus, right? The annual security report, which is published every October 1st, details crime statistics, reportable statistics over the last 3-year period leading up to that date, right? So it gives us a snapshot of what it looked like on that campus. And it runs the gamut from the most heinous of crimes down to things like liquor law violations or disciplinary infractions related to alcohol, or in some cases, weapons. So I encourage you to go and find that for Howard University. It's available on your website. You just have to type in annual security report. It'll also give you the opportunity to see the fire and life safety report, which gives you a view, as it might indicate, of any fires or incidents that may have occurred on campus and steps that are taken to mitigate that. So when we look at some of the areas of concern, starting at the top, it's no surprise that top of mind, physical violence, right? Whether that be individual acts of violence or whether that be targeted acts of mass violence. As we've seen, that is unfortunately and tragically on a rise. I think that institutions are taking steps, as we'll continue to discuss. They are taking steps to mitigate those threats. And I think each of us can do the exact same as we move forward. Mental health. I think campus mental health, if you actually, when university presidents were polled previously, typically their response as far as the greatest concern was enrollment, brand identity, right? So brand identity and enrollment, those were critical. And for a campus president, that makes sense. Campus presidents today, including your own, would say that's no longer the case. Now we're worried about the well-being of our campus community. First and foremost is campus mental health. It's on the mind of university presidents throughout. It should be on each of our minds, because unfortunately, campus suicide and campus risk of suicide, suicidal ideation, and campus mental health, whether that be following our global pandemic and COVID, whether that be following individual traumas or traumatic incidents that have occurred, or whether that be as a reaction or in response to wider trauma in our larger community. Campus mental health is of the greatest concern, and it poses a tremendous threat. As a matter of fact, it poses a greater threat to the life and well-being of our fellow campus community members than physical violence. Statistics show that it is more likely that an individual is going to take their own life than they are going to be, unfortunately, attacked or assaulted by a physical violent offender. I think the third one there, belonging. So one of the things that I love, I had the opportunity to speak at a conference, the National Conference on Higher Education Law and Policy down at Stetson Law School. And one of the things I loved was we had a whole section on DEI, and DEI expanding the concept to DEI J for justice and B for belonging. I think campus belonging is an area of concern for all campus communities, because having that sense of belonging, knowing that we're part of a community, knowing that we're part of a wider community of care and a wider community moving toward a common goal, right? To educate, empower, and inspire those who will follow in our footsteps, and to take those actions necessary to take what we learn here on campus and go out into the world and make a positive difference. That sense of belonging is so ever critical, and it's things that we, whether we're a student or a member of faculty and staff or the administration, we can make a difference and make people feel more a part of our campus community. Howard has a wonderful campus community, and you have a wonderful sense and dynamic of community. But even in that wonderful community, I would venture to say that there are those that just don't feel like they belong, right? And that can lead to all manner of things, right? We've seen it where it can lead to issues with mental health. We've seen it where it can lead to issues with physical violence. So it's critical. Sexual violence, stalking, and dating violence. Unfortunately, in the harsh reality, they tend to be traditional crimes. And I hate to use that term, but they tend to be traditional crimes on campuses, right? Sexual violence is certainly a major and continuing concern, right? I would put stalking and dating violence right there in that same category, because they are often the foundations or underpinning of a larger and more aggressive and violent sexual violence. Hate, as I alluded to earlier, not just because it's an HBCU, but Howard University can be the target of hate. You're right there in the middle of the nation's capital, right? You have individuals, you have graduates who have gone on to do wonderful things in extraordinarily high profile positions, all the way up to and including the Vice President of the United States. When we look at hatred, we can look back and there's been a rash. Allied Universal, our intelligence cell, identified a concerted effort this past October of bomb threats targeting historically Black colleges and universities up and down the Eastern Seaboard. It has certainly been a concern for historically Black colleges and universities. It has been a concern for campuses, and it is a concern for Howard. I think it's something that we have to be aware of, that these are fueled and motivated by hatred in our communities. Alcohol and substance abuse, unfortunately, also something of a tradition, a dangerous tradition on campus. Right? I think that when we look at our responsibilities, not only as a CSA, but our campus security authority, but when we look at our responsibilities as a fellow classmate, a faculty staff member, a member of the HU community, we have a responsibility to each other, right? We can make a difference in alcohol and substance abuse. And I would argue, and the statistics would support, that we have made a positive difference over the last several years. Burglary, robbery, and theft. We live in a world where, despite our best efforts, criminal activity will continue to exist, right? For personal advancement gain, individuals will take from other individuals, right? Having systems and steps in place to identify and very quickly remediate and to mitigate those situations is critical. And so with that, I'd like to move into our last slide, where we'll talk about some of the steps that we can take to improve campus security. And I think when we look at that, senior leader buy-in is number one. Right? These aren't necessarily in an order, any specific order, but that is absolutely top of the list for me. And you have that at Howard University. This is a perfect example, right? You have a leadership team that cares. And I think each and every one of us are leaders. Each and every one of us, as I tell our security professionals, and as is a mantra at Allied Universal, our security professionals and each and every one of us, each of you, are educators outside the classroom. We model behavior. We model what's right. We point people, and we have those sometimes difficult conversations to continue to point people in the right direction. We have to encourage community involvement. As I mentioned earlier, make it matter. It has to matter. We have to increase our security presence. And I think Howard University has done a tremendous job of that. They brought on Allied Universal to provide some additional unarmed security presence, really where we're focusing on that concierge and community engagement piece. We're looking at leveraging technologies and new and interesting technologies in order to make for a safer and more effective campus security experience. We have to improve emergency preparedness, doing exactly what we're doing now. And I can tell you, and I've had the wonderful opportunity to be there in the room, along with Ariel and Jarrett, that Howard University's most senior leadership is making this a priority. They're conducting tabletop exercises. They're having difficult decisions. They're looking at the realities of response. They're looking at the realities of posturing for preparedness. They're looking at the realities of being ready, God forbid, in the time that a tragedy might try to strike the Howard University community. I believe that we can be ready for that, but I believe that it does take us a continuous movement toward emergency preparedness. Mental health resources are strained throughout academia, right? Whether that be telehealth, whether that be on-site, whether that be counselors available in the community, mental health resources are critical. Most importantly, as it relates to mental health resources, we have to know, as members of the campus community, we have to know what they are. We have to know where to point either ourselves or other members of our community to get those resources. Addressing sexual assault and violence is certainly a major issue and something that I know that we talk about, most especially in residence life and student life, but it certainly has to be something across our entire environment and community. Fostering that sense of inclusivity, respect, and belonging. That sense of belonging, as I mentioned, is a major area of concern. We have to feel, and the folks that are in our campus community have to feel that they're part of that. They have to feel that they're respected. They have to feel that they have a place, right? We have the great fortune of bringing in individuals from around the world, from every economic strata, from every background and experience to come to our halls of education, whether that be at Howard University or elsewhere throughout the United States and the world. We have to go out of our way to make certain that we're making it an environment where everyone feels that they have a place, they have a voice, and they have an ability to make the most of that environment and that situation. Exercising emergency response plans, as I mentioned earlier, it's not enough just to have it. It can't just sit on the wall. Encouraging and providing opportunities to report safety concerns. That's critical. Remember I said earlier, that last step, right? Make a difference. That's the hard one. That's here, right? You have to have the opportunity to report the safety concern. And each and every one of us, whether we're bound by law or we're bound by our ethical and moral obligation as a member of our campus community, we have to be willing to say something. The reason that See Something, Say Something worked, right? Started in New York City after 9/11. The reason it worked is because 8 million residents of New York City were willing to see something and say something. They were willing to take that affirmative step to make a difference. Each and every one of us has to do exactly the same. Understand your reporting channels, understand the opportunities that exist for you to bring areas of concern, issues, things that might not even seem like much, but put them on the radar because they could be a very, very big deal. And finally, never stop learning. Again, it's not enough to have just one of these. It's not enough just to have this and then we move it along and we go on to the next thing in our life. We have to make this a priority. We are a community of educators. We're a community of learners. And each and every one of us will continue to learn about the threat. We'll learn how to make better decisions in that threat environment. We'll learn how to make and take those affirmative steps to make our campus community safer. This has been a wonderful opportunity to speak with you. I very much look forward to your questions. I know we've reserved time for Q&A after Jim's presentation. And so please do put those in the chat, get those over to Jarrett, and we look forward to answering them. And we very much look forward to working together. And on behalf of Allied Universal and all of our team and the Howard University team, It's a wonderful opportunity to be part of this campus community. I look forward to continuing to work with you. And thank you so much for your time and for all that you're doing and will continue to do to make this a safer and more welcoming campus community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. That, dynamic in running down the list of things that some of our CSAs should consider in their daily activities, not only as professors and workforce development experts, but also as mentors and friends to each other and a lot of the students on our campus. I would hope, as I get ready to load up Mr. Moore's slide, that some of the folks, if we solicit again your participation, you can log questions in the Q&A section. We'll be sure to get those to our experts. But just wanted to lift up, as we get the next presentation ready, how do we embed some of those things that Frank was talking about in our everyday activity? And I know that we hear often, do we check on each other? Do we check on our students? But how do we embed that in some of our industrial work? As a faculty member, is that something you build into a curriculum or build into your syllabus, that office hours can be designated for very specific conversations that may be relative to safety and belonging and other things outside of the academic realm? All of us serve as mentors. Do we check on our students who are kind of attracted to us? And do we ask them the question, hey, I know how you're doing in terms of internship. I know how you're doing in terms of your activities, but are you okay? Are you overwhelmed? How are things going with your family, with your friend groups? So in all the ways that the Howard community is powerful and that network is powerful, do we build into those items, or to that work, some of the items that Frank just listed? Just something to consider. If you have questions, please log those in the Q&A. We're glad to lift those up to James and Frank. And again, we hope that this is something that you really take seriously, because even the elements where you might notice something is wrong with somebody and you say, well, I'll see if it gets a little worse. I'll see if it goes on a little bit longer. I'll see if other people bring it to my attention. That might be the vulnerability that causes us great liability. It might cost someone's life. It might cost someone's well-being. It might cause trauma for the whole institution. So we just ask that anytime that there is an opportunity for you to observe these students and your coworkers and your friends on campus, take the opportunity to say, there's something I can do if I feel like something is wrong. We now move into our next presentation. This is for Mr. Moore. Again, he is our esteemed expert from the U.S. Department of Education. You guys are ahead of me because I'm terrible at the screen sharing.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much, Jarrett, and to the entire Howard family, starting with President Frederick, and certainly including my friend. He is my friend, Chief Marcus Lyles, and my new friend, Ms. Akila Adams, and also to Ariel and the rest of the folks who work on student wellness and student safety at the university. I want to just say at the beginning that just about everything that my friend Frank Spano said, I would just say ditto, and we're going to try to advance some of that a little bit further with specific attention on the Clery Act. Much like Frank said, folks, I just want to make sure that you understand that when we talk about the Clery Act, we are talking about some of the worst days that happen at our institutions. And so these can be very disturbing topics. We always want you to take care of yourself first. And if you need to step away, you do that. A little easier to do in the virtual environment. We hope we're going to have continued opportunities to train in these areas and to share information and build the best program that Howard can possibly have. To do that, we have to remember that we have to start with kind of a high-level introduction to these concepts. This is not a one and done. But we're always here to assist you if we actually have to make very specific case-by-case decisions about compliance. We would always rather help the institution first, and because that is best for all of us concerned. And also, of course, we have to make sure that we can have candor when we discuss these things. And so we just ask you to not necessarily publicize or pass this along to people outside of the Howard family. This is going to be Howard University training and initiative. And we'll go forward from that point. Let's go to the next slide if we can. We just always like to remind folks that the Clery Act started because of a tragedy and the willingness of a family who experienced that tragedy to try to bring about change for all students everywhere. And so this is the plaque that hangs on the campus of Lehigh University, where Jeannie Clery died in 1986. And the line that is on that plaque is, "Lest we forget the meaning of her death, that we must protect one another so that her life will not have been in vain." That has been the cause of the Clery family now for over 30 years. And it is something that we always remind that while it happened at Lehigh, it can happen at any institution. It is one of the sad aspects of my job, is that I deal with these kinds of tragedies all the time and try to help schools deal with them. But every school could find themselves in the same place that that institution and the Clery family found themselves in, and they have worked tirelessly since then. Ms. Clery's mom is still active in the space. I believe she's 86 years old now, and she is still spry out there advocating for every student on every campus. Let's go to the next slide. Just want to call to attention the fact that students do care about campus safety issues. We sometimes hear that students aren't really cued into these things. They get more cued in when there's a problem. Most students actually start out thinking that their schools are probably doing a pretty good job of keeping them safe. But this was a large study that was done. And I talked to the folks who conducted this study, and I said to them when they were putting together the parameters and methodologies, I said, make sure you talk to students from all of our various campus communities. You know, schools are very different. We want to make sure that all of our schools are so-called MSIs, minority serving institutions, HBCUs, Hispanic serving, our tribal schools, everybody. You have to get representation in these things. And they did a pretty good job of it. And what we found is that 82% of all college students say that they are concerned about their personal safety on campus, and that they take steps and considerations in furtherance of their own safety. Now, we sometimes deal with the situations where that doesn't happen, or where they take risks. We know about the neuroscience of people under the age of 25 and how they ascertain risk. So their ascertainment of risk and ours might not always be the same, but they are taking these things into account. They talk to their families about it. And 74% say that they start out in the first instance trusting their institutions to do a pretty good job of providing safety, of being transparent about information, of providing support when students and employees need it. As you might imagine, at the Department of Ed, we deal with the other 26% quite a bit, right? Let's go on to the next slide. So I am going to give you a one-page summary of the Clery Act. Now, I can tell you that there are sessions and training events that we do where it would take 3 days or 5 days to go through all of these things in detail, but we are not going to put you through all of that right now. We are going to summarize what we do. And so under the Clery Act, schools have to take in crime reports and provide crime statistical disclosures to the community, okay? And there's a very specific system that we use to do that. We call these things Clery reportable crimes. You'll see a bit more about that in a few minutes. But the most foundational requirement of the Clery Act is that schools have to publish an annual security report and distribute it to all of its students and employees. And that report has to include a significant amount of policy information about how the school will go about keeping people safe, how it will respond when crime occurs, and include this longitudinal crime data for the 3 most recent calendar years so that folks can be informed and can make decisions about their own safety and about where they choose to go to school in the first place if they like. A lot of people look at these reports while they are doing campus visits. Moms and dads look at them quite a bit. I know that because they tell us so. And then schools also have to provide their crime statistics to the U.S. Department of Education every year through a survey and data collection. Schools also have to issue something called timely warnings and emergency notifications. These are two different kinds of alerts to the community. Think of it this way: timely warnings have to be issued in response to these serious crimes against persons or property where there may be some kind of ongoing threat, right? Say an active shooter, for example, or robberies where we have not immediately apprehended the perpetrator. Emergency notifications cover a much wider range of serious or dangerous conditions. Here we might think about a chemical leak in a science lab, the terrible bomb threats that were targeted against so many HBCUs last year and into this year. We were very active in trying to help schools work through those matters. I can just tell you, as an aside, Howard University did an outstanding job of keeping people informed without causing unnecessary panic. And they took very decisive action to make sure that the right kinds of notices were issued at the right time. And they worked very closely with federal officials and with MPD and others to make sure that there was investigation of all of those threats to make sure that there wasn't, in fact, bombs on the campus. So that we have to do that. That's part of emergency evacuation and response requirements under the Clery Act, and it's just good general threat assessment. Schools have to maintain a daily crime log. Anytime you wish, you should be able to walk into the designated office at the university and take a look at the crime log if you like. You could also do that at any schools where your children may attend. Anytime you wish, no questions asked. You have a right to see that log. We work very closely, as I mentioned, on this issue of emergency evacuation and response. That is a big idea that has to really take into account the entire enterprise, because you never know where the emergency is going to originate, and you don't know to where it's going to spread. Schools that have housing, like Howard, also have some requirements when we have students who go missing. There are very specific steps we have to take, and we have fire safety requirements. There have been several big changes over the years to the Clery Act, and they kind of fall into two general areas. There are areas about student wellness, which is a topic that Frank talked about and something that we need to be aware of in this space. And there is sexual assault prevention and response. During the Obama administration, there was new requirements that came into the Clery space under the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2013. And we expanded the categories of crime that we cover, including dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking, including cyber stalking, which has been a very serious problem during the COVID period. And I'm telling you, it has stretched from the K-12 space through higher ed. And I've seen some of the most traumatizing behaviors perpetrated against very small children. You would believe it if you heard it, but none of us can countenance such terrible behavior in our school systems. Schools have to be putting programs in place to make people aware about sexual assault and how to prevent these kinds of crimes. And we also are required now under VAWA to do more in terms of accommodations and protective measures. If we could go to the next slide. One of the things that I would want you to take away from that list that we just went through is that all of that activity begins with a report, right? So one of our students, one of our employees, maybe a visitor to campus, is going to report that incident in some way to someone. One of the things that we have been stressing in the Clery space is that some people, I think wrongly, years ago thought that the Clery Act was about some kind of paperwork process. We write down some policies, we distribute some reports. It is not about paper, it's about people. And if you ever start to feel as though this is something we just do once or twice a year, you're missing the point. Frank made that point as well. I want to reiterate it. We want to create a culture of transparency, and one where people feel that they can come forward with reports of things that have happened to them and that those complaints will be resolved quickly and completely. I can tell you overall in the higher education space, I've worked in all different elements of it. I can tell you that students and parents and other stakeholders are less likely to complain to the government or file lawsuits if they feel as though they have been heard. Even if the institution ultimately doesn't agree with them about what has happened or what should happen as a result of a reported incident. If people feel as though they have been treated fairly and have been heard, they don't run to the government with complaints. I would encourage here that we elevate the Clery Act at least to the same level as Title IX within the institution. You'll hear a lot about Title IX. It had a 20-year head start on Clery. There's been a lot of activity in the courts about it, but I can tell you that campus safety and the work that happens under Title IX need to be elevated to the same level, and that level should be high. To do that, we have to engage our senior leaders. It's like everything else, whatever kind of training we're doing on a campus, if the senior leadership is not behind it, if people have the sense that this doesn't matter to the C-suite, things will not change. We have to have strong partnerships with our community, with our law enforcement professionals, both on campus and in the city, right? And I know that a lot of that work has been done and it needs to continue. We need to invest in training and technical assistance. We need to make sure that the people who are doing this work can access support from others, both on the campus and beyond it, right? Maybe through professional associations and the rest. One of the things that we have seen in this space is that as an organizing principle, we had to be very careful of the notion of special rules for special talents. In higher education, there is a tendency, no matter how much we care, to look the other way. If the person accused or the person who is at the center of some controversy is perhaps a faculty member who is well-credentialed, well-respected, maybe they have their own TV show on PBS. I had a case like that at a school once, and the school had done a very good job in the Clery space, except with regard to that guy, and he turned out to be a serial offender. You've seen some cases where perhaps we take a different approach to athletes or the children of our special alumni or our donors, those kinds of things. That never works. We have to make sure that we're engaging in ongoing training. We're doing some of that here in specialized training for key groups in areas like Title IX or sexual assault investigation, and too for our police officers. It's very important that our police officers understand the community, continue to understand how it might be changing, understand how they are perceived, and to make sure that they're interacting with our community in a way that is supportive, works in furtherance of safety, but where people feel confident in engaging with our public safety professionals. Let's go to the next slide. So there are 4 categories of Clery reportable crimes. There's what we call criminal offenses. That's the stuff they make all the TV shows about, right? Murder, sexual assault, aggravated assault, burglary, robbery, arson, those kinds of incidents. Those are pretty well understood. We have the hate crime categories, which have been built up over the years. They were changed significantly with the passage of the James Byrd and Matthew Shepard Hate Crimes Prevention Act. We have our VAWA offenses, which I mentioned earlier, and then we have arrest and disciplinary referral data for certain kinds of offenses, mostly in the areas of liquor law, drug law, and weapons law violations. The second bullet there is what is most key for our campus security authorities, folks who may be introduced to the Clery Act for the first time today. Under the Clery Act, an incident is deemed to have been reported when it is brought to the attention of a CSA or local law enforcement. It need not be reduced to a written report. The person reporting does not have to necessarily comply with all of the reporting procedures for the institution. Let me give you an example of why this is really important. Jarrett mentioned that we had a case at Michigan State University. Everybody sadly knows about the Larry Nassar scandal that occurred there. That case, had the school and others been complying with the Clery Act as required, could have been stopped in 1997 when a young girl, at that time 11 years old, who was part of a program at the university for young high-performing gymnasts, went to the coach of the university's gymnastics team and said, "Ms. Klages, Dr. Larry hurts me." And then in painful detail, which she remembers word for word to this day and was able to recite to me perfectly when I met with her some 15 years after the crime, said, "This is what he does to me." And that lady, who was a campus security authority, said to that child, "Well, if that's true, Larissa, you should probably go report that to someone," and sent her on her way. She just had reported it. That's the point here. That's one of the important things to understand in your role as a campus security authority, for those of you who are, and we're going to tell you who is and who isn't in just a minute. If we could go to the next slide. So who's a campus security authority? They fall into 4 categories. The first one is the most obvious. So anybody who is a member of our campus safety organization. So all of Chief Lyle's folks, the women and men who make up that department. Anybody who is part of another public safety entity. So all of those professionals from Allied Universal who serve the institution have to understand that if somebody comes up to them and reports a crime, they have to get that information to the public safety folks at Howard so they can evaluate what they need to do with that information. Individuals who are responsible for some kind of campus safety related function, but are not part of those folks in bullet 1. Who would that be? Well, we might have folks who work in our residence, our student residents, who are, some schools call them desk receptionists, right? They check IDs. They enforce the visitation policy. We might have folks who control who gets in and out of our parking garages who aren't necessarily part of public safety. They might be part of some other working group. During COVID, we had folks who stood literally at the schoolhouse gate, many places, and checked people's temperatures and gave them little quizzes to figure out whether or not they were allowed to come on campus. That's a safety related function. You think most of those people knew they were CSAs? They probably didn't. Then there's the big catch-all category. Institutional officials with significant responsibility for student and campus activities. Well, that could include a whole lot of people, and we're going to see on the next slide who some of them are. And then anybody so designated by the institution. So here we think about the fact that at some small schools, or if we have a separate campus, or at our medical school, or at some of the other facilities that we operate, maybe there's only a small group of workers there, and we say, if something happens at this location, you go to the location director, or to the head of the academic department even, perhaps. That person's now a CSA, whether they know it or not. Let's go on to the next slide. So, campus leadership and administrators. So one of the things we'll want to do is we continue to train, we continue to build our capacity in the Clery space at Howard, is we're going to want to talk to President Frederick and his executive team and let those folks know that they're CSAs. I think they know it at Howard, but a lot of schools, they're surprised when they find out. Residence life is just one of the biggest areas, because if you think about it, the young person living on a floor in one of our residence halls is likely to go to the RA before they go to anyone else. That means we've had to train our RAs so that they know minimally what to do, which usually involves getting the professionals involved. RAs shouldn't be investigating crimes, and beyond trying to document them in minimal initial ways, they probably shouldn't be involved past that point because they are fellow students. Our athletic directors and our coaches, including those graduate assistants. Anybody who knows the sports business and higher education today knows that, you know, the folks who get on TV, the head coaches, the ADs, people know who those folks are. It's the younger folks who are starting their career in coaching. They move from school to school every couple of years. They're trying to build a career. Policies are different from school to school. The average graduate assistant coach does not know that they are a CSA. We need to educate them about that. Victims advocates, and some people who carry the title of ombudsperson are CSAs. We know about our campus safety people. We're not as worried there. But we think of all the folks who are involved in student affairs, student life, our Title IX coordinators and staff. And this is where I just want to pause for a second and reiterate the point that Frank was making earlier. And I know all of you know this, but sometimes it's a reminder. We should think about the Clery Act as creating a web of reporting options. Not everybody wants to walk into the police department to report a crime. Some folks don't want to walk into the Title IX office. They're not comfortable there. They're comfortable with their coach. Those of us who came up in sports, I can tell you, one of the closest people to an athlete will be their position coach, right? That's the person they're going to interact with the most. And that becomes often the person they trust the most. Maybe it's the person who helps them as an academic advisor or as a mentor, right? Jarrett talked about the importance of mentors in higher ed. All key to doing what we were talking about earlier, about creating a community of wellness. We cannot be well if we are not safe. If we are not safe, we will not be well. Okay? Some of this is like straight out of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It's very hard for our young people and our professionals on campus to achieve their greatest goals, to become their truly best selves if they don't feel safe. And safe is not just about the fear of crime. It is the lack of, for example, adequate mental health resources. We have a mental health crisis in higher ed. We had one before COVID. It's worse now. And many schools who have experienced some financial issues over the last few years have actually cut mental health. That is not where we want to be in this day and age. We want to build out that community. We want to build our capacity to serve our students. So with that, I think we can move on to any questions that the team might have. I will say one thing about this slide here. This is something that I just ask you to do within your small groups inside the institution and then eventually collectively. Ask yourself, do you know how many CSAs there are at Howard University? Do you know how we go about notifying CSAs of their reporting responsibilities? These are all things to think about as you formulate your questions. What documentation do we keep about our efforts to identify and notify CSAs of their obligations? And do we provide any training? You're starting that process right now, and it'll continue to build out. So we'll pause there and see if there are any questions from the group. Thank you so very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Moore. Very informative. I know we have a lot of questions. I have a couple of my own, but I will begin with my colleagues. Our first question, how do you overcome false sense of security on campus? And what effective measures do you recommend to reduce the sense of insecurity among people on campus?
You want to start, Frank?
Sure, I'll jump on that. I think when we look at this false sense of security, it is endemic beyond just the campus community. I think we as a people have become, unfortunately, complacent. There's this increasing belief that, oh, it's terrible that it happened over there, but it's not going to happen over here, right? That I think is the biggest and one of the greatest challenges. When we look at insecurity on campus in particular, growing up, I'm after the time that people were hiding under their desks, right, for nuclear fallout. But I'm mercifully before the time, right, at least as a student, of this age of the active assailant. And unfortunately, the realities change and the realities have changed. And I think that our sense of insecurity as students or as members of the campus community can be mitigated to some degree and potentially a great degree by an awareness of the realities of the situation that face us, right? Whether that's the reality of the threat, whether that's the reality of the response, right? And I think Howard University is extremely well positioned, right? And has, whether that's on campus capability or in conjunction with Metropolitan Police Department and federal partners, is very well positioned by way of response. But I think just as importantly, individuals have to recognize that they're part of a larger community, right? We're in this together, right? And we are going to be safe together, or we are going to be vulnerable together. And the choice is very much our own. In many cases, as you are likely aware, the ability to make that decision can many times change the frame of mind in which we operate, right? We can see things from a position of empowerment and capability rather than from a position of potential victimization and vulnerability. And so I think that efforts like this, efforts like our smaller group engagements that may exist on campus, and that sense of campus community belonging is going to help not only remind us that the reality of the situation is that it can happen here, right? It has happened here. It will continue to happen here, but we as a community can do something about it. And so we're already doing the right things. The campus is already doing the right things, continuing down that path.
Yeah, I'll just say this very quickly about that. I can't tell you how often I have discussions with college presidents where the first line is, I didn't think this could happen here.
Yeah.
The criminologist in me always thinks about the fact that crime is everywhere and crime moves, right? So there is no such thing as an institution being immune from these things. Now, at the same time, we have to find the sweet spot between vigilance and fear. Right? We don't want to live with fear. We don't have to do that. We have to be situationally aware, and we have to have processes in place that are likely to detect where the problem is and focus on it. We don't want to live in a police state, right? But we want to have safety and security. And so I think that finding that sweet spot between those two things is key.
Our next question, thank you for this informative session. As part of Howard's Telehealth Training Center, we have for more than 10 years provided training on interpersonal violence. Including in the training is Clery Act on the campuses of minority serving institutions, and we use multiple case studies to bring our training to life and make it culturally relevant. But beyond the required annual crime statistics, we've heard that penalties levied to some universities over others make honest reporting difficult. So therefore, some do not report everything. Can you speak to the importance of transparency and how we can change the culture of penalizing reporting and instead ensure campus safety and resilience?
Yeah, so, the schools that have been cited for violations under the Clery Act are usually cases where either they don't have the right structures in place to identify those incidents and disclose information about them in furtherance of that transparency goal. So institutions that tell the truth about the situation will always find themselves in good stead with this department. I can tell you that, and that's true at all times. It's certainly true under this president. I'll give you one quick example. There is a case that you could look up of Eastern Michigan University. Eastern Michigan University, and I'm never picking on an institution if I list them by name. These are settled cases that can teach us something about the principles that we derive our training materials from and our instruction from. In that case, they covered up a murder. There's no question about it. In 2005, they covered up a murder, right? It was a horrendous case, and it was handled horrendously by the institution. That is why that case is still talked about all the time in the higher education space. Would they have been honest and just disclosed the incident for what it was? Quite frankly, no one would be talking about it today. But it still comes up at professional conferences and in other discussions and in Washington, D.C. on the Hill as one of those cases that showed the need for the Clery Act and laws like it. So I think we just need to encourage across our institution. We want to be straightforward with our students about the crimes that occur, the threats that pertain in our community, and what we're going to do, most importantly, to mitigate them, right? And that's how we get buy-in, and we have support from our communities. We're not talking about anything where we're just going to try to make people afraid. That doesn't work. But where we help people be vigilant.
Our next one, how do you institute a plan for students to feel comfortable reporting officials without fear of retaliation?
Wow, I'm going to tell you that one, that is entirely up to the Howard University community. You have to show folks that you want them to come forward because you want them to get the help they need. and help can come in a lot of different forms. This notion of belonging and community, which is just essential in higher ed, I will guarantee you there are students who probably at your institution, just statistically, it's math, they are suffering with something right now. We know they are, right? It could be something really big that requires a significant intervention, maybe an interdisciplinary approach, or it could be somebody who just feels as though they're isolated, somebody who doesn't really have a friend. They're there. You might not notice them right away. We need to have ways to find those folks who need help, right? And get them the help they need. And we deliver that help in a way that is without judgment, that is truly supportive and sustained. And when we do that, you will find that students will come forward. I am dealing with an institution right now. They had a sad history of retaliating against sexual assault victims. The entire case would be turned against them. What were you wearing? Did you have a drink? Have you ever used drugs? Do you engage in premarital sex? All of it was turned around on these victims. And what do you think happened? Exactly to the questioner's point, right? Is that people just stop reporting. It's like, I'm worse off for having come forward. We need to make sure that the folks, when they come forward, are better off for having talked about what has happened, and we start finding a way to make sure that we can support them in their life's goals. You know, the most common result of sexual assault in the higher education environment, student quits school. The student just quits. And then they experience all of the concomitant and associated impacts of that. Not the least of which is that if we're going to higher education today, we probably have student loans. You know how many of the students involved in these cases end up in default on their student loans, which impacts their ability to get the job they should have, right? Impacts their family life, sometimes for decades, right? Whereas if we get that student who has experienced a sex crime or a hate crime or some other kind of violent assault help, we accommodate them from an academic standpoint. We make sure they have a safe living environment. We can help keep that student in school, which delivers on the mission of the Clery Act in Title IX, Title VI for our employees, Title VII, right? So that's the way we do it, I think.
Yeah, Jim nailed it. I would only add to that, you know, the importance of truly anonymous reporting capabilities, knowing what those are, knowing what the resources are that are available. And I would reiterate Jim's point, we have to get rid of that stigma. Right? There's no stigma when somebody goes to an academic advisor because they want to get a better class load for next semester. There's none when somebody goes to a financial planner because they want to plan for their retirement. There's none when somebody goes to a career counselor when they want, you know, to advance their career. But unfortunately, the reality on campus, the reality in many of our institutions, in the wider community at large, is that there is a stigma associated with either reporting a mental health consideration for ourselves, going to get help, right? That stigma needs to be overcome. And the other one is that people are reticent or reluctant in cases to report on campus. And I think providing those, you know, when it comes to safety or security concerns, Jim made the point earlier, it's not enough to do so 6 steps down the line when we've waited to see, right? The wait to see time is over. We have to make those actions and take those steps today. And it takes institutional courage and it takes individual courage in order to do that. So I think providing those opportunities, making them as streamlined as possible, and reducing the negative stigma, and knowing that what we're doing, though it is often a difficult decision, is in the best interest of our campus community and its safety.
One quick question, and I guess this would be for both of you guys. Can you, if it's possible to have a 30-second answer to this, because it's such a complex area, could you describe the best way for people to understand the geography and timing of Clery? Because oftentimes we get questions about an incident happened, it wasn't on campus, you know, and then there's questions about, was it in proximity? Or there was an incident happened, the person was caught, why didn't, you know, wasn't a crime alert sent out? Is there a 30-second answer to that?
Yeah, we'll try to give you the really short version. And this is probably a topic that we'll expand on in another time. we're looking specifically to the properties that the institution owns and controls for educational purposes. There are probably properties that Howard owns that are not used for educational purposes right at this moment. If they're not used for those purposes, they're out. We also have properties that are perhaps owned and controlled by some of our recognized student organizations, most often Greek letter organizations. Those are in. From there, what we do is we look at the immediately contiguous public property, what the law calls immediately adjacent and accessible public property. That's usually the sidewalks and the streets around the campus, nothing else, right? Those are the places where you're required to act for Clery purposes, such as for sending out warnings. That if you were to consider all of the other space, especially in an urban setting, that intersects with the campus, that space is out. And so it would be an excellent topic for the next time we get together to talk a little bit more about the geography rules.
Yeah, that could be a 30-hour conversation, but this, I would just say that for those on the call in the CSA role, this Campus Security Authority role, even if you're not even sure if you are, you're not, the best bet is when in doubt, report, right? When in doubt, report it, right? We'll let the administration, we'll let the campus public safety and the Clery coordinators make the determination whether or not it counts or not with regard to the report itself. But as it affects campus public safety, we have an obligation, legal, moral, and ethical, to make that report and to make for a safer campus community.
Agreed.
We got one more question, and I know our time is drawing to a close in the next 10 minutes, but I will ask this one. As a staff member, I have found that I'm often the go-to person for personal problems among my fellow staff. I'm building an arsenal of tools to point those in need to proper resources. Is there some cheat sheet or website where I can find varied contacts and persons to whom reporting is appropriate? I've taken several trainings about reporting, but I feel overwhelmed by the variety of types of reporting that are necessary.
This is a brilliant question. So first of all, kudos to whoever raised it, because that's somebody who's thinking about this idea of wellness and belonging and trying to help folks get the assistance they need, right? One of the things that we could definitely talk about with the right folks at Howard is producing that kind of resource. Let me just tell you this, one of the requirements that was put in the Clery Act for sexual assault survivors is we have to have a very specific resource that we usually call the survivor's brochure that reduces down to a couple of pages all of the particular kinds of resources, supportive measures, protective measures that we have at the institution, so that the person doesn't have to dig through 10 different publications, or for that matter, even the 100-page annual security report. It's something that somebody who is in crisis, who is in trauma, could it maybe by themselves or with the help of one other person, figure out where they need to be to get the kind of help they need. Maybe if somebody just wants a doctor, right? They need a physical exam. They need a counselor, right? They need an advocate. They need somebody to help them interact with the Metropolitan Police Department because for whatever reason they feel better over there. Whatever they need to be there in their best possible position. That's something that the Clery Act requires. What you're raising is something that should probably be in the Clery Act, is to try to, when we have an institution that's bigger, and especially a complex entity like Howard, there are a lot of places you could go. And they have titles that sound similar one to the other. And folks might not know exactly what service they can get from which place. So maybe one of the things we could do is to assist going forward with the development of a resource that maybe fits on one page or on two sides of the same piece of paper anyway, that would help folks find that resource that they most need to help that individual who's in crisis.
I could say from the public safety side, I completely agree with Jim on that. From the public safety side, when we talk to our campus security professionals and throughout the campus public safety environment at Howard University, and I would extend it even beyond that to the wider campus community, each and every single one of us has the opportunity to be a superhero for somebody, right? But the best chance of being a superhero is you got to have that superhero belt with all the resources on it, right? And knowing those resources is critical. I think establishing a clearly defined resource list or reporting checklist and or timeline is a great best practice on campus, right? So, but each and every one of us has to kind of build out our own resources as they are available. And sometimes they're not on campus. Let's keep that in mind. Sometimes we have to point people
That's right.
to other resources in the wider community.
Gentlemen, again, we appreciate you. We've had in excess of 200 participants on this call who've been with us from start to finish. I know that they're grateful. I speak for my Bison colleagues in saying thank you very much. I would just ask that each of you close out with your final thoughts on what could an already great Howard University do to be even greater to champion Clery Act compliance, support for student, faculty, and staff, and to build a better campus safety infrastructure and culture.
Right.
I would just say, know that you're doing the right thing. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's not the easy or fashionable or social thing to do, but many times we have to do the right thing, even if it's difficult. We have to know that we're part of that campus community, and we have to take ownership, not only for ourselves, but for those to our left and our right, those that are there going through this experience with us, right? Whether that be as an administrator, a faculty member, a staff member, a student, a visitor on our campus. We have to know that we're together in this, leverage the resources that are available, identify those, make a change, right? Make that difference. We can. Every one of us has the power to do so. And it's in each and every one of us to take that affirmative step and make a positive difference in the campus. Jim?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I'll leave you. I could tell you a whole bunch of stories. I'll tell you one right now. There was a young man at a school where we were conducting an investigation who ended up dying in a hail of gunfire when the police had to take him down because he shot up one of his classrooms. That young man had been an honor student his entire life, had been active in his community, active in his church. And you know what undid him? He had trouble making the transition from high school to college. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that he said himself, he hadn't done very much for himself through high school. His mom did everything for him. Wonderful lady, by the way, I've met her. And when he got to college, he said, in the paperwork that he left, his note, he said, I didn't know how to act. And then he went on to explain what that meant. And one of the things was, he said, I couldn't find anybody to make a connection with here. I couldn't find anybody to eat lunch with. He actually was not eating because he didn't want to go to the cafeteria and sit by himself. And he said, I wish I could have made contact with just one person who understood me. That young man also went to the psych services center at his school 17 times. 17 times. And they sent him away because they didn't think it could happen there, right? And his life ended a couple of months later, like I said, in a hail of gunfire after he killed 9 people. You got to look out for your community. So you do this not just for yourself or because the law says you're supposed to, you do it for your neighborhood and your neighbor. And if we all do a little bit better with that, we will get to where we need to be. So I thank you for all you're doing.
Gentlemen, thank you again so much. Just want to remind everybody remaining with us, you can always reach out to the Department of Public Safety at 202-806-1100. Again, we want to thank Akila Adams, our Clery Compliance Officer, for arranging this. You can reach her at akila.adams@howard.edu. You can always reach out to me, jarrett.carter@howard.edu. We are greatly appreciative of the Bison community taking so much stake in being more informed and being more empowered as advocates and supporters of our students and of each other. Remember, this is not just for students, but it's also in the betterment of faculty and staff. So gentlemen, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Remember, this is recorded. We will be distributing this. It will be a resource that you will have in perpetuity. And we look forward to inviting you to our next conversation about Clery compliance and other areas of building a Bison safe culture of campus safety on our university community. Thank you so much, everyone.